Hi, welcome to Guess Who Explained. Today I've decided to make a video going over Fate mistranslations. For better or worse, the Type Moon franchise has been running for decades now, with a ton of different English distributors as well as many series that were never blessed with an official translation. Unsurprisingly, this has been the perfect breeding ground for inconsistent and incorrect translations, which is why I'm making this video. Considering how complex and nuanced the Nuances is, the only way you could ever fully understand it would be to become a Japanese reader yourself. Thankfully, thanks to the rise of online translating communities on Beastslayer and Reddit, as well as artificial intelligence, spotting mistranslations has become more accessible than it used to be back in the day. While consulting them doesn't make you an expert on the language by any means, they still help out a lot. With the intro out of the way, I would like to start by explaining what makes the Japanese language so special. You can't really dive into mistranslations without understanding some basics first. Let's begin by breaking down the three major types of Japanese writing: hiragana, katakana, and kanji. Hiragana is a phonetic script, meaning each character represents a specific sound, much like letters in an alphabet. Think of it this way. In English, the letters O, R, A, N, G, and E don't mean anything on their own. They just represent sounds. But combine them and you get a word that does. Orange. Hiragana works exactly the same way. Hiragana characters are pretty easy to spot thanks to their soft, curvy look. They're used for grammatical particles, verb endings, and adjective endings. The most prominent example you've probably already seen is the particle no, which expresses possession, kind of like of or s in English. You might recognize it from anime titles like Kimetsu no Yaiba or Shingeki no Kyojin. In Fate, it shows up in phrases like inner sea of the planet or reverse side of the world. Now, the second type of Japanese written language is katakana. Functionally, it works identically to hiragana. Each character represents a sound, and combining those sounds gives you a word. What sets them apart is how they look and when they're used. Visually, katakana is easy to recognize thanks to its sharp, angular look, with most symbols being pretty simple, usually no more than 3 strokes. The key difference, though, is what each script is actually used for. Hiragana handles native Japanese words and grammar, while katakana is reserved for foreign loanwords, foreign names, and specialized terminology. In Attack on Titan and Frieren, for instance, character names are written in katakana because of their Germanic origins. In Fate, English terms like saber, archer, Excalibur, Chaldea, texture, quantum time lock, and archetype are all written in katakana as well. Basically, if something has a foreign or fantastical origin, chances are it's written in katakana. The third and final type of Japanese writing is kanji. Unlike the other two, where each symbol represents a sound, each kanji represents an actual word or concept. Generally speaking, the more complex the concept, the more strokes the character has. Take the kanji for person, hito. If you squint a little, you can picture those 2 strokes as a pair of legs. Another fun example is from Dragon Ball. The symbol on Goku's uniform is the word kame, which means turtle, which is a nod to the turtle school run by Master Roshi. Again, with a bit of imagination, you can make out the shell and tail in the shape of the character. Now here's the thing with kanji. There are thousands of them, and some of them can carry different meanings simultaneously, making it really difficult to read, even for native Japanese speakers. Due to this, Japanese speakers came up with footnotes called furigana. Basically, you write down the text in kanji, and then for each complex keyword, you write down in hiragana how it's pronounced. You've almost certainly seen this before without knowing what it was called. It shows up a lot in manga, actually. Since manga is read by a wide audience, including younger readers who haven't learned all their kanji yet, publishers will often add furigana next to the more complex characters so nobody gets lost. In the case of Type Moon works, a great example would be this kanji on screen. It can be read as Sora, in which case it means sky, or as Kara, which would mean emptiness. This is where the name Kara no Kyokai comes from. While localized as Garden of Sinners, its literal translation would be boundary of emptiness. Finally, the last thing you need to understand about Japanese is that words don't have a plural form. In English, words are either singular or plural. Generally speaking, all you need to tell them apart is that the plural form uses an S at the end. In the case of Japanese, there's no equivalent marker. A single word covers both singular and plural, and it's simply up to context to tell you which one is meant. Take the word neko, meaning cat. On its own, neko could mean a cat, the cat or cats in general, there's no way to know just by looking at the word itself. You'd have to rely on the surrounding sentence or on additional words thrown in to clarify. Otherwise, in everyday speech, the listener is just expected to figure out from context whether one cat or several are being talked about. This is why translators often have to make a judgment call on whether a word should be singular or plural in English, since the original Japanese simply doesn't specify. In summary, Japanese doesn't have a natural marker to express plurality, making translations context-dependent and sometimes extremely arbitrary. On the other hand, we have three types of writing. Firstly, kanji, complex symbols that carry specific meanings. Secondly, hiragana, simple and curvy symbols that represent different sounds. Thirdly, katakana, simple, sharp symbols that are used to write down foreign names. Additionally, Japanese people use furigana, notes usually written in hiragana, that specify how a specific kanji is pronounced. With the introductions out of the way, let's delve into some specific topics. While furigana reading notes are generally used as I just explained, authors sometimes use them in a creative way, where the kanji and the furigana above it say two completely different things. In the example I provided earlier, they were just using hiragana to express the phonetic sounds of how you should pronounce the word. It was just an aid to determine which meaning of a kanji with several meanings was intended. However, sometimes the kanji might literally mean one thing, while the furigana tells you to read it as something else entirely. For example, I might write down the fallen angel, and then on top of it, Satan. This creates a kind of double meaning, where the character is saying one word out loud, but the text is quietly conveying a deeper concept underneath. In anime, this is normally shown with words written in Japanese using kanji, with a furigana note on top using katakana. In these cases, the katakana uses an English loanword as a proper name, while the kanji has an entire phrase that helps contextualize what the katakana is referring to. For example, both Artoria and Richard the Lionheart shout Excalibur. That's because both names have the same katakana written on the furigana note. However, when you look carefully at the kanji written underneath, they are different. Artoria's says Sword of Promised Victory, while Richard's reads Sword of Forever Distant Victory. We see the same pattern with quantum time locks. English speakers don't know this, but there are actually two types of them. Firstly, there are quantum record anchoring belts. These are the Human Order Foundation seen in FGO. Then there are the Spiritron record anchoring belts, which are the ones the Moon Cell uses to manage its data. Both have the same katakana, but the kanji is different. The ones in FGO anchor the records of parallel worlds, which are quantum realities, hence the word quantum record anchoring belt. The Moon Cell, on the other hand, is anchoring the light particles in its core that are used to simulate parallel worlds, hence the word Spiritron record anchoring belt. This might seem like a silly example, but it's one of those things that's really hard to translate into English, which is why localizations often cut them down entirely. While in cases like Excalibur is relatively harmless, since the story already provides enough context to know they are different, in other cases it has proven detrimental for English speakers. One of the first examples that comes to mind is from the Solomon Singularity, when Gautier explained he was going to use his virtual noble phantasm, Ars Nova, without ever specifying what its function was. However, if you look at the Japanese script, you will see that below the katakana it reads Light Convergence Ring, indicating that he is using it to gather together the Spiritrons harvested during the Human Order incineration. Similarly, in the Uku event, Kama's inner space is identified as an inner conceptual universe. These phrases were cut off from the official translation entirely. These two examples show instances where the kanji beneath the furigana provides additional context. However, there are opposite examples where the furigana had a key role. For instance, in NA, the scene stating how fast the characters were diving in the Atlantic Lost Belt only had the measurements in knots. However, in the original Japanese lines, the sentence includes a furigana note with the conversion to kilometers per hour. On the other hand, in Japanese, you have the word Heiko Sekai. This term could be translated as parallel world or adjacent reality. Under normal circumstances, it would come down to the localization team to choose the translation they deem more fitting. However, thanks to FGO, we have seen the term Parareru Warudo used in katakana above it. This confirms that parallel world is the official canon term used in universe, even in the original language. Following this trend, we have the word Akuma, which could be translated as devil, demon, or evil spirit. For decades, official translations localized it as demon, whereas some fan translations used demon to differentiate the term from mate. However, a few years ago in the MiHoYo event, it was finally confirmed that the official term is actually devil, since a character used that word written in katakana as a Furigana note on top of Akuma. This means that every time you see Kiara being called a true demon, the actual term should be true devil. Okay, let's change subjects now. What about planets? Why do translators sometimes disagree on whether a word should be translated as planet or star? In Japanese, you have 3 keywords to describe astronomical objects. Firstly, there's kosei, which refers to fixed stars like the sun. Secondly, there's wakasei, which means planets, celestial bodies that orbit a star. Finally, there's tentai, which means celestial body. So far, so good. Different words, different meanings. The problems arise when you focus on a 4th extra word, hoshi. While its literal translation is star, this isn't a scientific term. In Japanese, hoshi is a metaphorical term. It's a catch-all term that can refer to actual stars, planets, or even people. This is similar to English, where people call Venus or Lucifer the morning star. Another example would be mainstream actors like Johnny Depp, who we refer to as stars of Hollywood. To any English speaker, it's clear that neither Venus, Satan, nor Johnny Depp are literal stars, but we use the word to refer to them regardless. In those contexts, the meaning of star is metaphorical. Japanese people do something similar, except they use different words to actually differentiate when the word star is meant literally versus figuratively. In everyday Japanese, hoshi is a colloquial term used to refer to planets, whereas the word kosei is considered a bit more formal and relegated to more serious conversations. For example, Japanese people often say kono hoshi, which literally translates to this star when referring to planet Earth. Similarly, extraterrestrials are often described as people from a betsu no hoshi, meaning another star, even when they're talking about people from Mars or the Moon. This is why when translating the term into English, understanding the context of the conversation is fundamental. The most infamous example of the term hoshi being mistranslated is in One Punch Man. If you follow that series, you'll know there's always been a debate over whether Bora's collapsing star Roaring Cannon was star level or not. In the manga, he says he's going to destroy the surface of the planet Earth, but in the Blu-ray version, it says he can destroy stars. People have often treated the Blu-ray exclusive line as an upscale. However, this isn't an upscale at all. If you actually look at the kanji, both versions use the same word, hoshi. All this confusion was caused by a translator arbitrarily translating hoshi as star, because the text he had to work with simply didn't provide any context to determine whether it should be localized as planet, star, or celestial body. Due to this, he settled on the literal translation. Therefore, this isn't a case of 2 different source materials contradicting one another, but rather 2 different translators disagreeing over a vague term. Keep that in mind because it will be relevant in a second. Before that, though, I need to point out how Fate consistently uses the word hoshi to refer to the planet Earth. For example, when they say inner sea of the planet, they use the word hoshi, not wakasei. The same goes for when they call the archetype the soul of the planet, the cerebral corpus of the planet, or the sense of touch of the planet. The word used is always hoshi. Fortunately, translators usually don't screw these up because it's clear they refer to the planet Earth. As you know, in Type Moon, some planets are alive. However, what not many realize is that this is an extremely rare occurrence that only happens in specific sectors of the universe tasked with birthing intelligent life. When a planet is created in one of those sectors and meets specific requirements, it's infused with a soul and comes to life. These are the planets that then develop living organisms and an archetype. Both Ordeal Call 3 and the Type Moon manuscript confirm that the chances of this happening are near zero. Throughout the years, I've seen people falsely claim that all celestial bodies have true ether, citing a scene from Babylonia as evidence. The dialogue reads, "True ether, the power that gave birth to planets and formed the stars." There are several problems with this line. As I explained at the start of the video, Japanese doesn't have plural markers, often relying on external context for further clarification. This scene provides none, making the words planets and stars as opposed to planet and star completely arbitrary. Secondly, the word star is never used. It says planet and celestial body. This isn't a matter of interpretation. The sentence simply doesn't say kosei or hoshi. It uses wakasei instead, which means planet, full stop. Then it says tentai, which means celestial body. For some reason, they translated that as planet. To summarize, the accurate translation would be the power that gave birth to the planet, the substance that forms the celestial body. Alternatively, you could use the plural form, but just note that that's an arbitrary localization. Nothing in the original sentence expresses plurality. Either way, it's just saying true ether is the substance that gives birth to planets. It doesn't imply stars like the sun were formed by true ether, let alone that true ether exists on all celestial bodies in the verse, regardless of whether they are alive or not. Moving on, we also have Enuma Elish. As stated in Gilgamesh's CCC matrix, the god Ea is believed to be the quasi-deification of the power of the planet, which turned, smashed, and stabilized the surface of the Earth when it was still covered in gas and seas of magma during the primordial stage of the Earth. Those familiar with Fate lore know that, ever since the planet came to life, it has used elementals and conceptual spirits to manage many of the functions needed to maintain itself. For example, Wandjina has existed since the era of the dinosaurs and is tasked with managing the atmosphere. Alternatively, there's Pale Rider, which is part of the world's logic meant to carry death to humans. What this text from CCC is saying is that Aya is a deification of the system that was used to stabilize the surface of the planet 4.6 billion years ago, when it was still a ball of gas and magma. It helped create the texture that covers the surface, which is why, when Gilgamesh uses Enuma Elish, it becomes an anti-world attack. This is pretty easy to understand for anyone with a basic grasp of Fate lore. The problem arises in Fate Extella, where Gilgamesh's profile completely butchers the quote and mistranslates planet as stars. If you actually look at the Japanese text for both entries, all the sentences describing Ea's origins are identical. None of them use the plural form or use the word kosei. One thing I will grant the Extella translator, though, is that the text says Hoshi, which, as I discussed, can be translated as either star or planet. So it's not as atrocious as the line explaining true ether, where they just made up the localization. Either way, the difference between the Extella translation and the one in CCC comes down to different translators interpreting the text differently, not because the source material itself is different. If you're familiar with Fate lore, it's blatantly clear that the former is the accurate one. Finally, to conclude this section on the kanji Hoshi, I would like to cover the scene that explains how Kirshtarya's anima animosphere works. It's basically the same translation error as with Enuma Elish. First of all, every time you see the words planets or stars in plural, that's an arbitrary localization choice. If you look at the Japanese raws, there aren't any suffixes suggesting plurality. Moreover, what's being translated as stars here is the kanji Hoshi, not kosi, which means it could just be referring to planets, not stars. In fact, this is actually what the text tells us. He is aligning planets. In this case, the word is really wakase. This whole scene could simply be saying that Kirshtarya is moving the planet Earth to align it with other planets in the solar system, and it wouldn't contradict anything in the entire text. Given that this attack is on par with Artemis's planet-busting noble phantasm, this interpretation is far more realistic than the one proposed by NA. Now, leaving planets out of the way, I would like to do a quick speedrun of the most prominent mistranslations. I will start with those where the translators simply got confused, and then move on to those where they straight up made up what the characters were saying. In the first group, we have quotes from Fate Zero and FGO Babylonia saying Enuma Elish or Tiamat could destroy the universe. In Japanese, the word for universe is uchu, which means universe, space, or cosmos. However, this word has never been used in those series to describe what Gilgamesh and Tiamat can destroy. The words used are always sekai, which means world. Similarly, in Strange Fake, it says Gilgamesh compressed the entire universe. Here, the word isn't either uchu or sekai, it says Shinra Bansho, which means all creation. While this word can be translated as the entire universe, the connotation is different, particularly when referring to Ea. It's referring to texture on the surface of the planet, not the literal cosmos. On the other hand, we have the line from Fate Extra CCC saying it, the moon cell has as much energy as the sun. However, if you look at the kanji, it says Taiyoke, which means solar system. Given that the words in Japanese are practically identical, it's clear that the translator simply misread the line. A less understandable mistake, however, is the infamous line from FGO saying nine-tailed Tamemo can destroy the multiverse. In Type Moon works and interviews, the word that's always used for multiverse is Maruchibasu, which is literally the word multiverse written in katakana. However, what Tamamo actually says in this scene is Sanzen Sekai, which literally reads as 3,000 worlds. Now, this term has 4 different possible interpretations. In everyday and classical Japanese, the word Sanzen Sekai is actually a shortened, poetic way of saying Sanzen Daisen Sekai. In turn, Sanzen Daisen Sekai is a term referring to the trichiliocosm, the billion worlds that make up the universe in Buddhism. However, it should be noted that when the term Sanzen Sekai is used in colloquial conversation, it generally just means the entire universe or the whole world, often hyperbolically. Those are the first possible interpretations. Tamamo could be referring to Buddhist cosmology or making a hyperbolic statement. However, when you actually research Fate's version of Buddhist lore, you realize that Fate doesn't treat Sanzen Sekai and trichiliocosm as synonyms. As stated in Fate Extra material, they are 2 distinct concepts. On the one hand, Sanzen Sekai, the term Tamamo used, is equated to a galaxy. Then, when you fuse 1,000 galaxies, you get 3,000 great worlds. It's only once you multiply that again by 1,000 that you get a trichiliocosm, which is likened to a supercluster. This description confirms a few things. Firstly, Fate's version of the trichiliocosm is nowhere near as big as the observable universe. Secondly, the term Tamamo used is 1 billion times smaller than the trichiliocosm. To summarize, if you contextualize Tamamo's statement with other Fate content, assuming she wasn't being hyperbolic, you could argue she is galaxy level. Alternatively, it's also possible that Tamamo was simply making a pun, and that the term Sanzen Sekai literally just means 3,000 worlds. This latter interpretation would make sense since she's comparing herself to the human order incineration, which burned the human world across 3,000 years. In either case, no matter which interpretation you pick, translating this as multiverse is wrong. Not only does the text not use that term, but by localizing it that way, you are removing all the nuances the original Japanese script had. Okay, now we start entering the heavy stuff. The human order. The human order is the most important piece of type moon lore, and it is written as Jinri. However, in FGO, this has always been localized as humanity. I don't know who came up with this stupid choice. Humanity is written as Jinri, meaning it's pronounced similarly. However, the word is used so many times in FGO that the mistranslation seems deliberate. This is by far NA's worst sin. By localizing an extremely nuanced and magical term as human order, using an everyday word that's also related to the original concept, all the translators did was gatekeep NA readers from ever learning for themselves what the human order is, how it works, etc. However, it doesn't stop there. NA doesn't just mistranslate it. Sometimes they cut it out entirely. For example, every time you see the name Chaldea Security Organization, what it actually says is Chaldea Human Order Security Organization. Similarly, in the Tunguska event, when Koyanskaya mentioned the counterforce, what she actually said was the counterforce of the human order. Alaya and the human order are not synonyms. Alaya is simply one aspect of it. Other translations that are absolutely ridiculous are those involving top servants. In Japanese, the strongest servants you can summon in a Holy Grail war are called Topu Savanto. As you can see, it's written in katakana because they're using an English loanword. This means the English translators could just translate it directly as top servant. That's what Fate Extella did. However, for some reason, FGO-NA has made it their duty to mistranslate this term 90% of the time, always using phrases like top-class heroic spirit or high-ranked servant instead. If you thought that was ridiculous, you should check out the Solomon Singularity, where they localized third magic as third-rate magic. That's nightmare fuel in itself. NA, for some reason, just likes making up translations every once in a while. In Saber Wars 2, Space Ishtar referenced the metaphysical walls that separate parallel worlds. However, NA translated parallel worlds as dimensions instead. On the other hand, in Fate Extra, when Twice explains how the moon cell works, he says it has simulated trillions, maybe quadrillions, of alternate versions of Earth. However, for some reason, Fate Extra translated that as infinite instead. It's clear that infinite timelines don't exist. It was stated in Fate Extella and the case files that the universe couldn't possibly sustain them, which is why timelines that deviate too much don't persist. We also know that the moon cell has as much energy as the solar system, that it's finite, and that the data inside the core is worth hundreds of millions of light years. Nevertheless, you'll still see Fate wankers use mistranslations or hyperbolic statements to argue the opposite. One claim I find particularly intriguing is the one saying, Gotia harvested infinite possibilities. However, the Japanese text doesn't use the word possibilities. It says infinitely layered or infinitely stacked instead. Moreover, this is one of the only times NA has actually gone out of their way to correct a mistranslation in a later update. Now, people still cope by using the accurate translation, claiming it makes Gotia multiversal, but that's just a sign of not knowing how the human order incineration works, or what human history is. First of all, we have numerous statements saying Goetia never affected parallel worlds. Alternate timelines like Stay Night or Tsukihime were unaffected because Lev Lanier took his own life in 2015, before being possessed by his demon god. This action saved their respective timelines past and future, confirming that Goetia's flames don't travel across parallel worlds. Moreover, the term human history itself doesn't involve alternate timelines. For example, in the human history that Waver comes from, Chaldeus doesn't exist. Going by Moonlight Lostrom's encyclopedia, we know that human history refers to the texture on the surface of the planet, as the kanji for human history was used as furigana for texture. This also confirms that textures aren't alternate timelines or parallel worlds, as despite human history having been erased on 2 separate occasions during the run of Fate Grand Order, their timeline continued to exist without any issues. Fate cosmology is infinitely simpler than Fate wankers want you to believe. Each timeline has its own universe with its own planet Earth and its own texture/human history. That's why destroying the latter doesn't erase the other two or affect alternate timelines. What Gotia was explaining in the Solomon Singularity isn't that he burned multiple timelines, but that he burned the surface of the planet for 3,000 years, with the term infinite simply being hyperbolic. On a similar topic, there's a scene in Garden of Avalon explaining how the inner sea of the planet works. It uses words like phases and planes of existence a bit loosely, making the quotes more vague than they actually are. The original text explicitly states that Avalon is simultaneously inside the Earth and outside of it. It shares the same coordinates as the planet, but it's also phase-shifted across several dimensions. This is why it cuts off all interference up to the 6th dimension. Moreover, the word used here for phase in phase-shifted is the same one Gilgamesh used in Strange Fake when describing how his clairvoyance allows him to see parallel worlds. Hippolyta used the same word when describing how she holds memories from alternate timelines. This confirms that each timeline exists in a different phase of existence, and that what makes the inner sea inaccessible is that it simply exists, shifted from its respective world. This is why not even parallel world travel can reach it. I already explained this in more detail in my video going over dimensions, so check it out if you're interested. This lore mechanic is pretty important. For example, in the Fuyuki Singularity, Olga Marie claims that Chaldeus is on a different scale than them. However, if you look at the kanji, what she actually says is that it's on a different phase, using the exact same terminology as parallel worlds and the inner sea. This might be the reason why Chaldea's base, which was shielded by its magnetic field, was able to survive the human order incineration, or it existed outside of time. I regret not having found this mistranslation sooner, as it would have been great to cover it in my Gotia video. Moving on to less important translations, there's a craft essence saying, Iskandar's reality marble is infinite. If you look at the kanji, the word infinite is never used. It says Great Sea of Sand instead. Another absurd hyperbolic claim is that the line used by Zeus in Olympus makes his domain infinite because he said boundless space. If you look at the original phrase, what's being mistranslated here as boundless space is the word Sora, written in katakana, which, as I said at the start of the video, means heavens or sky. Other statements I find particularly intriguing are related to speed. In Babylonia, for instance, the Lamu were stated to move at 30 kilometers per hour, with some individuals exceeding 100 kilometers per hour. However, in NA, they just translated this sentence as incredible speeds. Incredible indeed. On the other hand, in the Atlantic Lost Belt, Achilles' chariot is stated to move at hypersonic speeds. However, in Japanese, the word used is onsoku, which just means the speed of sound. Similarly, in that same event, Achilles claims to be ultrasonic. In Japanese, he just says he is faster than sound. Moving to a different game, we have Fate Extella. In Iskandar's side story, we were cursed with one of the most infamous mistranslations regarding servant speed scaling, one where he claims Ku Chulin moves faster than the speed of light. As I have covered in previous videos, the words for light or faster than aren't even in the original text. The translator simply made them up. What Iskandar actually says is that he wonders whether the nickname Distant Afterimage was referring to Lancer. Lastly, another mistranslation I recently discovered is the one in Stay Night that claims Medusa attacked Saber Alter at light speed. This one is incredibly overused by fate wankers to argue all servants are faster than light, as Saber Alter, someone with D rank agility, reacted to it. Well, this line is also a mistranslation that was already removed in the remastered version of Stay Night. What the narrator actually says is that Medusa is moving at high speeds. The confusion arises from the fact that the word used is konsoku, which is pronounced identically to light speed in Japanese. However, they are written differently. To conclude the speed section, I would like to point out that in Japanese culture, the expressions Mach speed, speed of sound, lightning fast, and speed of light can sometimes be hyperbolic. In English, we sometimes do the same, like saying a boxer throws lightning fast jabs. You are not saying they are literally moving as fast as a bolt of lightning. It's just a metaphor. Well, in Japanese, they do the same, but more casually. They just form part of their colloquial expressions. For example, in the Tsukihime remake, when Arquid got mad at Shiki during their date, she was stated to have done so at Mach speed. In that same game, a nurse was treating Shiki at the speed of lightning. Alternatively, in Saber Wars 2, the Space Mohawks threatened to kill Fujimaru's party at Mach speed, which NA localized as quickly. Knowing that these types of phrases can be metaphorical is incredibly important. Otherwise, you end up looking like a fate wanker who thinks Medusa is really as fast as the speed of light because of a line in Stay Night. This is what happens when you cherry-pick statements and turn a blind eye to the pop culture of a foreign work. A Japanese speaker or someone who values consistency would look at that statement and determine that it's not literal based on Medusa's noble phantasm being stated to move at a max speed of 500 kilometers per hour in that same game. You'd also have things like Anastasia saying her B-rank agility isn't enough to break the sound barrier, or BB saying not even A-rank servants can surpass the speed of light. Doing so would fatally wound them, as shown with Meltrilus and the Dioscuri twins. Now, this doesn't mean no one in the verse has ever moved at those speeds. It just means you need to be careful whenever you see them. If you ever look at a quote using these expressions and the text doesn't change its meaning in the slightest by substituting the expressions with really fast or in the blink of an eye, chances are you are looking at a metaphor. Finally, to conclude the video, I would like to go over words that aren't technically mistranslated, but that you need to be extremely cautious of. For example, the word Earth. In English, Earth with a capital E is the name of the planet we live on, whereas when it's used with a lowercase letter, it refers to the ground or soil. In Japanese, they actually use two different words to differentiate the two concepts. First, there's chai, which means ground or land. Then there's Chikyu, which refers to the actual planet. Whenever you see people saying Gilgamesh can split heaven and earth apart, the word used for earth is chi, not Chikyu. The same thing happens with statements from Fate Extella claiming Karna's Vasavi Shakti can scorch the earth. Those statements do not make those attacks planet level. Another example is the word karma. In Japanese, there are two different words, go and shukugo. The former refers to actions that have reactions. It's used broadly for actions that are good or neutral. Shukugo, on the other hand, refers to burdens carried over from previous lives, and it usually has a bad connotation. It refers to the bad deeds of your past lives. Sadly, these nuances are lost in translation, as English uses the same term for both, karma. Knowing this difference is important, because whenever you see characters like Musashi or Muramasa discussing how they can perceive or cut karma, they aren't always referring to the same concept. Similarly, there's the word Buddha. Buddha is a title used for a bodhisattva who has achieved enlightenment. In Buddhism, there are many of them. However, when we say the Buddha, we're referring to one of them specifically, Siddhartha Gautama, the one who preached Buddhism. Just like with the word karma, English uses the same word for both concepts, whereas Japanese doesn't. Whenever you see people in Shimosa saying their swordsmanship is comparable to that of the Buddha, the word they use is hotoke, which refers to the Buddha as a collective, not the actual saber-class servant seen in Fate Extra. On the other hand, I'd like to discuss what happens with the terms nothingness, hollow, emptiness, and void. In English, these words are generally synonyms, so you can use them interchangeably. However, in Fate, they use a different word for each one, and each refers to a very distinct concept. Sadly, Fate translators are generally unaware of this, so they end up mixing the words up. This brings me to my last point, one for which I've received strong backlash in the past. The term higher dimensional. In Japanese, there are two terms, koji and kojigen. Strictly speaking, both can be translated as higher dimensional, but the nuance of each is distinct. The former is better translated as higher order, as it refers to an entity's hierarchy. It's synonymous with higher level or higher rank. The latter, on the other hand, refers to higher dimensional in a physical and mathematical sense. Whenever a Japanese speaker wants to describe a character's dimensionality or cosmology, to specify that they're composed of more than 3 dimensions, the word they'll use is kojigen, not koji. This is why I say this statement doesn't make Goetia 4D. The word used is koji, not kojigen. The translation isn't necessarily wrong because the term higher dimensional can be metaphorical, like when they say in Boku no Hero that All Might's power is on another dimension. They just mean he's on a higher level. However, it should be noted that while the word used in Japanese can be translated as higher dimensional, it doesn't carry the nuance fate wankers wanted to have. Goetia doesn't have a single statement saying he's higher dimensional in a physics sense. The only instances where the word kogen was used to describe him were when referring to the demon gods before they became demon god pillars. For those who don't know, the demon gods are devils, meaning they're spiritual beings that need to possess a human in order to incarnate and gain a physical body. This is how they became demon god pillars during the human order incineration. They possessed humans like Lev Lanur. For context, non-corporeal entities being higher dimensional is nothing new to fate. That's the case for human souls, heroic spirits, and divine spirits. A human soul being a higher dimensional life form doesn't make the human it belongs to higher dimensional as well. The same goes for Goetia. The spirits that make up the demon gods are higher dimensional, but that doesn't retroactively make their physical bodies or abilities 4D as well. Okay everyone, that's it for today. I'm not a Japanese expert or anything, but I have researched this topic quite a lot. I think it's pretty much undeniable that fate works have mistranslated stuff. It's just human nature to make mistakes. This video isn't intended to beat down on translators. If it weren't for them, we wouldn't be able to enjoy this series. Still, it's important to understand that translators, at the end of the day, are just a middleman between the source material and yourself. Lazy localizations and translation mistakes can greatly affect the way you experience a story, not to mention making you misunderstand how the lore or power scaling operates. This is why people who blindly follow translations have ended up spreading so much misinformation over the last decade. At the end of the day, you need to fact-check translations every once in a while. I hope this video did a good job presenting the most common mistranslations and letting you know what you should be careful of going forward. With that, have a great day, and see you next time.